The third one, which is Article 2C, is to implement policy leading to the physical destruction of the group. Aha, they say. That's just another way of saying killing, physical destruction. And yeah, it could be, except that they already said killing. Straightforward, very clearly. Don't need to skip down a line and say it again, really complicated, so that people have to sit there and scratch their heads. That's clearly not what they meant. I mean, killing is 20% of the definition. The other 80% is non-lethal. So what would physical destruction be? Well, how about taking a land-based people and putting its territory 200 feet underwater up James Bay? How's a land-based people maintain itself as a group in being when its entire homeland is submerged? How about you bring in Peabody Coal Corporation, drag lines down a big mountain and dig about 40 feet of the surface of this arid land off to open coal pits? Where exactly are the people who live there, the big mountain Denang, supposed to go to reconstitute themselves? What they end up being is scattered in Winslow, Arizona, or Flagstaff, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, Chicago, Denver. Yeah, real hard to retain a sense of group cohesion and identity when you're scattered across an entire continent and there's every bit of 10,000 of you. See, the group's gone. Individuals may live, but the group's gone. That's a genocide. That's what they're on about. Force the diaspora, scatter them to the winds, lop off their political leadership, lop off their spiritual leadership, prohibit the speaking of their language, prohibit their religious practices, so on, so on, so on. Cultural genocide is the term that was applied to that by Raphael Lemke. And that was the one to U.S. and Canada, by the way, cultural genocide. That was the one they were really upset about. They had to get rid of that one. Gee, I wonder why. We know why Stalin wanted to remove political aggregates from the list of protected classes, because he'd been eradicating them all the way through the 1930s. And if he'd agreed to that going into law, he would have been self-convicting. Well, hey, that applies to the other side of the coin as well. The United States and Canada were objecting, not on principle. They were objecting because the way Lincoln had written that, they would have been convicted by, self-convicted by signing it. So they had to eliminate it. Okay, fourth one. Fourth one has to do with prevention of births in a target group. Now, there's more than one way to accomplish this. The usual means of sterilization, compulsory sterilization, involuntary sterilization, call it what you want. That's what we're talking about. It could also be accomplished with small peoples. And with indigenous peoples, you're often encountering small peoples. Just intern the population, segregate them by sex, refuse to let them interact. You can accomplish the same thing without surgery, so you don't want to make it a medical intervention. But prevention of reproduction by whatever set of means is that fourth criteria. Now, down in the States, the Indian Health Service was running a program of involuntary sterilization, and this has been conceded. It resulted in the sterilization of something on the order of 40% of all American Indian women of childbearing age back during the 1970s. And when they were called out on this, they said, well, it wasn't because they were Indians, it was because they were poor and they're having children place an undue financial burden on taxpayers. They made the same argument with regard to Puerto Rican women. They did almost as much damage to the population down in that colony on the island. I don't think they did as many sterilizations proportionally Puerto Rican women up in the North American continent, although they were hitting them pretty hard too, and poor black women in the South, and even some poor white women. So there's something to the economic argument, but Indians were hit especially hard and through an Indian-specific health delivery system. In response to that, once they were called out and denied that it was based on anything other than an economic incentive, this is the American response to getting caught red-handed, no pun intended, engaging in genocide is they took the Indian Health Service out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and placed it in the Department of Health and Human Services. No one was indicted, no one went to jail, there was no one prosecuted, there was no one, to my knowledge, even fired or received a letter of reprimand, and a couple of the officials who were running the program were promoted once they got over HUD. Yeah. And that one's just a cold case. And the last one has to do with, well, actually, before I go into the last one, there's something else that needs to be said. Now, I'm running down Canadian law for you, because unlike the United States, which refused for 40 years to ratify, to accept the idea that the Genocide Convention might be binding upon it, Canada ratified early, 1952. Now, ratification requires, in order to be accepted by the UN Secretariat, that each nation ratifying effect an implementation act. In other words, make it part of the domestic law. Canada did that. But in the parliamentary debates up here, you're going to see a real interesting thing. It's going to say, well, you know, a lot of this was written, they framed this convention in view of the late hostilities in Europe, meaning World War II. And certain things that are contained in here don't really apply to Canada. So those 5 criteria under Article 2 that I just ran down, they only included 3 in the Canadian Implementation Act. What did they take out? Well, they took out the one about causing serious physical and mental harm. And they took out the last one I'm going to talk about now, which is the forced transfer of children from the target group to the targeting group. Okay? Let's back up for a moment to that prevention of births. And this is for everybody who wants to make that kill association again. If you actually affect, across the board, sterilization, they certainly have the capacity to do that now. Take target group and involuntarily sterilize the whole lot. At the end of one generation, that group is going to be biologically out of existence, just as completely as if you stood them up against the wall and blown their brains out, one and all. So if you're saying they got to be killing people in order to be engaged in genocide, you're allowing them to accomplish the thing through a medical intervention just as completely as if they had been killing, but you can't convict them of genocide because genocide requires that you be killing people in a definable group. And of course they didn't kill anyone at all. That's the hypothetical premise. It would never work that way in practice, but you understand the principle here. But now how about you just don't sterilize them either. Take the children. Let them have the children, but then take the children. Push about a policy of blind adoption. Blind adoption means they're going to be adopted by non-Indians, but they can't know who their birth parents were, who their people were, have any association with their own heritage, which means they can't possibly know who they are in the world as Indians. They will only know themselves as what they're raised by non-Indians to think of themselves as being. Well, in terms of the contribution to the continuity of the society, that's just as effective as preventing the birth itself, is it not? But now if you expand the definition to include both killing and sterilization, you're allowing this process to occur. And of course, the main transfer of children from target group to targeting group in Canada and the United States as well happened not through blind adoptions, although there were a lot of those, but through, well, down there they call them boarding schools, up here you call them residential schools, and you're talking half of every generation at a minimum for 5 consecutive generations. They're to be systematically deculturated as Indians, not to understand themselves as Indians, but to understand themselves, the meaning of themselves in terms of something they can never be. Because you've got a phenotypically racist society here, and an Indian who has been deculturated and reculturated to see Indians like a white man, still going to look like an Indian to that white man, and going to be discriminated against accordingly. And so you place them in a position of being psycho-intellectually indoctrinated to be what they're going to be rejected as being. There's no place for them really in white society. Still today, even more, we will all concede, because everything's much more admissible when it's a little bit in the past, okay?